weeks into one particular topic. However, everything that you will do as far as your home study stuff will be, so like videos, like YouTube videos. I've attached like overviews of different things, and so you'll just be required to read all of that. And so that'll make everything kind of easy. And then when we come to class, if you have computers, we'll want to bring computers because we'll open up it actually on the computer to be able to research or look over the materials. But a big part of your homework stuff will be reading from the book. And what I'm going to encourage, because it's such a short book, to read it multiple times. And so then looking for different themes, looking for quotes, and then meditating on the quotes, what you think they mean. Because the book itself, as you will find out, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, was written, it was Tolstoy's first book after he had a pretty radical conversion to Christ. And so before that he was not necessarily a Christian. But so that's what we have coming up. I think so after today we'll have 2 more weeks finishing up our study in Egypt. And so then that 3 weeks from today will be our first venture into Russian literature and the biography of Leo Tolstoy. All right, so that being said, we should have wrapped up here with chapters 19 and 20. And it looks like a lot of the questions are pretty similar. And so we'll go through an overview here of chapter 19. And so chapter 19, A House Divided, I think that's where pretty much every question came from. And so let's put some flesh on the bones here of where we are at historically. And today, before we get into the questions, really briefly, I want to talk about now kind of the deconstruction of culture. There are 2 factors that were at play and are at play always whenever we're dealing with anything. And so whether we realize it or not, we are constantly in the process of either of building culture, our own individual culture, or tearing down our own individual culture. And so we talk about that pretty extensively, not only in our Tuesdays, right, and talking about putting away kind of an old pattern of life or an old way of life, but walking in the new way. But we're constantly kind of in this ebb and flow of life, right, where we're learning new things, and as we learn new things, hopefully we're putting those things into practice, and we're cultivating, right, cultivating, bringing new life to something, and we're making shifts. And so sometimes in life, right, those will be pretty dramatic shifts. And so those can be things that happen to us, or they can be choices that you make. But what we'll see with A House Divided in particular is kind of the degrading of culture happens both by external pressures and internal pressures. We see here in this chapter that the external pressures are what? Who are the people really close to Egypt? It said a very specific type of people. What were their names? Do you guys remember?
Cushites.
What's that?
Cushites. No.
Not the Cushites. And this,
Canaanites.
not the Canaanites. It starts with an L.
Libyans.
Libyans, yes.
Okay.
And so the Libyans. And so if we had the map here, you can see that in Africa at the very top here, there's Egypt. There's Libya, which is now modern day Libya. But at those times, remember, right, a people group would have been very nomadic, and so they would have carried over a lot of like different territory. And so the maps that we have today are helpful for today, but those aren't the maps that were really necessarily back in those times. And so you had these massive groups of people that called themselves Libyans, who now were coming into Thebes and some of what would have been lower Egypt to them, which would have been more in the north. And so we see increasingly this external pressure getting put on Egypt. And that in and of itself, from a cultural standpoint, is not the problem. The way a culture is deteriorated is very rarely from external pressures. But what does the external pressures do? It creates internally some things that are now having to be dealt with, right? That the pharaohs and the leaders now, they have to deal with the pressures externally. But what is the constant battles with Libya create. It creates things internally with the Egyptian people now. So they're having to contend for things that they never really had to contend for as much in the past. Why? Because Egypt was a great power. And so you would not see as many warring armies really strive to set out earlier on when Egypt was a great force. And so we see this true, too, kind of translate into our own life, how we can, if we're not careful, we allow the external pressures, right? Things that happen outside of us and oftentimes outside of our control to begin to squeeze us. Well, that will cause internally some things to happen. God designed us that way. But what do we do with the internal pressures, right? And so Pharaoh, Egypt as a whole, is left with kind of this choice of how do we navigate and manage both the internal pressures, things that are going on within the confines of the country, the confines of our cultural understandings, and then how do we kind of push back or protect against this external force. Well, most people, and Egypt was certainly a part of this, and we see culturally some of the difficulties we're seeing in our country, is the way that they manage this is not by trying to actually make positive change, but continuing to use this concept of propaganda to speak out against. And so what does Pharaoh do? Pharaoh begins to try to insulate himself from the unpopular opinions of his day, tries to continue to consolidate his power. Even though everything around him is crumbling, there's a consolidation of power, trying to keep that and maintain control, at least the vision of control. The problem is well, let's think of this tangibly. Think about a time in your life where things were happening outside of you, but it was causing a tremendous amount of pressure. And that could be emotional, it could be the way that you thought, and you were really kind of uncomfortable. Now you can put on a good happy face, right? Externally, try to look good, try to feel good, to be in control, try to manage yourself, and that would be somewhat disingenuous. Has anyone ever done that where you knew something really rough was going on, but you put on kind of a happy face and pretended like nothing was there? Well, the outcomes of that, emotionally and psychologically, they have a lot of studies to that, is not very good. We are designed to be genuine people where our emotions need to be expressed. Now, they need to be certainly harnessed, right? We don't want our emotions to just fly over everyone, over all things, right? So there's got to be some level of control there. But we are designed, a culture is designed to have things good and bad flow through it. And when things are going in a negative way, right, a healthy culture is designed to be able to absorb the difficulties, the pressures from the outside, the pressures from the inside, and then to be able to manage to redirect it towards a proper path. Well, Egypt has we've seen, as we've read, Egypt has failed to continue kind of what has made them successful. Their ability to redirect towards their common purpose has now really gone astray. And so we see Libya here, and the Libyan culture is now beginning to really take over. Not necessarily Egyptian culture as a whole, but it is establishing itself as at least an equal to be contended with. And I would say this, historically speaking, very rarely is it the wars that are won that shift cultures, but it is a kind of a subtle belief in the minds and the hearts of people. And so what are wars generally fought for? Wars are generally fought for over ideas. That's what they're after. And so it's not just about victory in and of itself. The goal or the purpose of the stated war is to bring about whatever vision of culture they believe to be better. In this regard, the Libyans are pushing against thousands of years of Egyptian culture, and they're beginning to try to find, as we talked about a few weeks ago, an identity of their own. And so first question here says, what took place in order to bring the Libyan people into Egyptian culture, knowing that they had fought many brutal wars against each other before? Is that anyone's question here, or is that one of the boys?
Must be Elijah's.
Must be Elijah's, okay. And so kind of generally what we were talking about here, right? And so any war really, at its very face value, is a cultural war. Think about this in our revolution. Our revolution was not just we didn't like the English. There was a cultural revolution. There was a way of life that the Americans believed was a better way of life. They believed that their way of life was not represented, right, in England. The whole idea of taxation without representation. Well, here, kind of in a similar vein, the Libyans have a different kind of understanding of how life should work and should operate, and should we be under the power or the control of this foreign belief structure? Well, they would say no, and so naturally they would begin to push back. Now this took on, ultimately it manifested itself in an actual physical war, because that's how you resolved issues. Right? Imagine for a minute. I mean, this happens in households, does it not? Maybe not, try to kill each other.
I can see what we're talking about.
but we battle one another, right?
Yeah.
When we have difference of opinions. Now I want you to think of a time, maybe where you had a sibling and you got into a pretty heated discussion, argument, whatever, over an idea. Are those always noble ideas? Are those always, like, when you look back on it, do you think that was worth fighting for? Or oftentimes do we have maybe some struggles in there it was much more emotionally based? You didn't like something, you didn't like a temperament, personality, the way somebody said something. They took this or they took that, or they didn't get permission. Or you just woke up on the wrong side of the bed, or they woke up on the wrong side of the bed, or you don't like how they looked, or their hair was this way. Like, we come up with all of these justifications, right? Well, think of that on a much grander scale. And so again, what we have to understand from a cultural perspective is that there's a great cost in going to battle over anything. The Bible clearly tells us that we should be people of war, but we do not war, we do not battle, we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. See, in many ways, the Libyans are pushing back against the principality or the power of. It wasn't just Egypt in the natural. We need to really make a connection to this. The war is not just a natural thing. There's something going on in the supernatural, in the spiritual realm, where the authority of Egypt is being tested and challenged. Now, from a cultural standpoint, the Libyan culture is not really all that far off from the Egyptian culture as far as their understandings of the greater world as we would understand it. But what we see here historically is that there's kind of a major pushback against kind of the former way, or the way of Egypt, as it were. All right, number 2 here, it says, what made the rulers of Kadesh think of themselves as superior? Is that one of the boys too? Sounds like a boy's question. And so again, we're talking about ideas that are manifesting themselves, right? I mean, this is true of every cultural power. And so they would believe that they have a better understanding of how life ought to work, that they are more dominant in certain ways. And so the concept or the ideals of Kadesh would have been held much higher. And so they would have thought of themselves as being more enlightened, more powerful, more understanding, things of that nature. And so again, we see, right, external pressures. Kadesh, Libyans, Hittites, Hyklos, all of these for hundreds of years now are beginning to push against Egyptian understanding. Number 3, how did the Libyans reign over Upper Egypt when they were enemies of the Egyptians?
That was my question. And looking back up, the first question, it seems like it's a lot similar. I didn't know that's what one of the questions was, but this one was more of a question I had, like not one I had answered.
Okay.
So, yeah, and I guess with whoever did the first question could have probably answered it perfectly with what they said. But, yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm going to answer this text from you just tell them there should be staff at the lunch. So this was one that you were asking. How did the Libyans reign over Upper Egypt when they were enemies of the Egyptians? Just have them go into the kitchen. Just say there should be staff there, directly there.
Staff in the kitchen?
Yeah, just have them grab a staff member. And so, okay, so let's talk about that. So what you're saying is, how did people, the Libyan people, kind of begin to take power?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so again, this is where historically the difficulty in ancient times were that it would take weeks or days to get to other cities, right, across a whole expanse. And so this is why it would be really important for the Pharaoh as a central governing body to have people who are truly submitted to him throughout all of the land or the regions, right, in order to be in control. We see this biblically. So a biblical example of this was Pontius Pilate. So you know who Pontius Pilate was? He was a Roman kind of overseer of Jerusalem. He's the guy that managed that region. And so when the Jews actually brought Jesus there to him and say he must be, dealt with because he's going against Caesar, and Pilate's like, well, I don't see anything wrong with him. I wipe my hands of him. Well, his whole responsibility, Pilate's whole responsibility from that time was to make sure that Jerusalem stays peaceful. So if Jerusalem goes crazy, Pilate is in a lot of trouble. And how did Pontius Pilate get there? Well, he had friends in the right places, basically. Well, that would have been the same thing. Throughout Egypt, you'd have all of these prefects or overseers of certain regions that would have a connection to Pharaoh, and oftentimes it'd be a family member or a really close friend of the family to consolidate power. Now, the problem increasingly, again, was that what was happening, the debt was skyrocketing, there was some problems with famine and things like that. So for a common person, if your way of life is affected, so think of this in modern times, like gas prices are increasing, which means food prices will increase, right? Because food is shipped a lot of places. So now all of a sudden we have food prices there. Well, if your wages don't increase, but prices increase, what does that do to you? Well, that puts a very big pinch on your budget, right? And so you guys may not see the effects of this because your parents insulate you from that. But as a parent, as somebody who has to be responsible, it makes you have to kind of consider, well, what kind of things can we cut out? What do we have to cut out of the budget? Maybe there's some entertainment things. Well, all of a sudden we're not doing some things that entertain us, or we're not doing things, getting out and being able to do things that we were before. That begins to create a level of discomfort, anxiety. Right? And there's that emotional side of that where now I'm not just thinking about today and the difficulties of today, but then emotionally, if things are going from bad to worse, where does that change your perspective of? Does that make you feel hopeful for the future? Or do we as humans tend to go inward and go, okay, well, if it's this bad now, imagine. Well, most people operate, again, out of a fear-based understanding. That was what the Egyptians were trained to think like. They had been so preconditioned to be in a position that was under the authority and not in the way that we understand it. Like when you guys hear authority, hopefully what you hear is that's a really healthy thing. Why would anyone worry about authority? Like I submit to my parents' authority and the authority of the leadership and the authority of Christ. Those are all really good things, but not here, right? Here, it would have been a very fear-based thing. And so people began to lose hope. They began to continue to be marginalized. Well, that can only last for so long. What we see here is happening is that as some of those things happen, what the people are aware of is there's kind of the power of Pharaoh is kind of crumbling. And if I'm a common person and I begin to see the power of Pharaoh is not what Pharaoh wanted it to be, right? God on earth. Well, that might embolden me and empower me to maybe stand up against it a little bit more. And it's never, historically, generally speaking, it's never just, one person stands up and it's, like this big revolt. It's slow, it's the slow churning of culture that's turned over. And so, in fact, let's flip to chapter 20, because I think it, if I remember correctly, I think it talks about the tarnished throne here, and it talks about the separation of the two lands. Yeah, right at the very start there, page 383 in your books. It says the separation of the two lands into their constituent parts might have been the new political reality, but it was anathema to traditional Egypt ideology. So anathema was kind of like at odds with, or it was something that was kind of disgusting in the sight of.
Against, kind of?
Yeah. which emphasized the unifying role of the king and cast division as the triumph of chaos. As the Hyksos had shown 5 centuries earlier, the sheer weight and antiquity of pharaonic beliefs had a tendency to win in the end. So what is that saying is that traditionally speaking, the power of Pharaoh, regardless of what was going on, was enough to be kind of the foundation on which the rest of the culture was built. And so because the pharaonic power, the whole idea that we started out with, divine kingship, was so ingrained in their belief, and it was without fail and without fault, Pharaoh was in control, that minor skirmishes or things that came up, they were kind of always able to manage it because Pharaoh was always perceived to be powerful. The problem is that Pharaoh has not been perceived as been powerful now for a while. There's been a lot of major hits to this idea or concept of divine kingship. And so like any house that stands, right, if it's built on a faulty foundation, the foundation is cracked and it begins to shift, right? Like you guys see that on your property, like the shifting of things can cause problems. And generally, it's not, culturally speaking, it's not something that is like a major shift overnight. It is the slow shifting of culture over time. And so it says this, and as the Libyan elite became more entrenched, and so imagine some Libyans who were living in that area and they were going along with, right? We're kind of going to go along with this whole Egyptian thing because we don't have a choice. But increasingly, they're feeling a little bit more comfortable believing what they believe, standing up for what they want to stand up with, pushing back against some of the beliefs of the culture of Egypt. It says, more secure in its exercise of the power, of curious thing happened. In certain important aspects, it started to go native. And so what that meant was, increasingly over time, the Libyan culture began to rise up against the Egyptian culture. And so we see Egyptian culture is declining, Libyan culture is increasing. Well, Libyan, the belief or the structure there was not powerful enough yet to overtake the whole country. But it was powerful enough to take over a city block. And again, this is how cultural shifts begin. When we look at even the American Revolution, it didn't start with all of the colonies united. They had to wrestle to get to that point where they could be in agreement of whether they should push back against England. It started out with minor pockets of people. Right? And you have some who are like hyper, like militant about it. We see that in the American Revolution in the Sons of Liberty, who went and threw a bunch of tea into a harbor, right? They weren't going to make a visible show of it. Well, then there's a lot more subtle, right? We see that in the life of Benjamin Franklin, who was a diplomat and wanted to be much more like, how do we go about this in a kind and peaceful way, and how do we use reason and logic to discuss? And so both of those things are at play here.
He was an elder statesman.
Yes. Yeah. And so we see again, how do cultures shift? Well, there's an external force that is placed, which begins in the life of people around there to have an internal kind of turning over. And again, I would say culture and the word cultivate are really closely connected here. How do we build culture? Well, we cultivate culture. We sow seeds, we plant seeds. And so the seeds here, the Libyan seeds, the ideal of life that was beginning to be planted, has taken over a long periods of time. But we see now historically, the power of Egypt, the throne, as it says in chapter 20, is tarnished. No longer are the people in Egypt looking at the Pharaoh and thinking that is God on earth. They're beginning to question that. And if the problem is, culturally speaking, if the Pharaoh is not God on earth, and he cannot control the Nile, and he cannot promise me all of this, the stability that comes with that, right? Meaning I'm going to have food for my belly in very practical ways. If I'm not going to be protected from outside places, well, that's a problem for Egypt. But what does that mean, though? How does that empower people who are not Egyptians, who are living in Egypt, but not Egyptian? Well, it's going to empower them more so to be like, okay, I don't have to live under this ideal anymore. I can be who I believe I need to be. I can begin to promote Libyan way of understanding, a Libyan way of living. And again, it's a subtle push. And what we see is that the Libyan forces actually begin to take over cities. Well, again, it starts in it's the cultivation, right? It's a single seed is implanted into a single heart. And what happens culturally is that same seed, the seed of whatever, freedom, independence, right? Yeah, right, yeah, rises up in each person. They begin to connect from their understanding in agreement. And when you have enough people that have the similar voice, they're able to become a power in their group, and collectively a little bit further out and further out. See, this is what separates the idea of American democracy and freedom as it was understood by our framers. What makes it so powerful is that they understood that they couldn't have a central power like Egypt did. That it couldn't be, the power of America couldn't be built on just one ideal. That there had to be power that is given to the people ultimately. That the only way for something to work, and if you think about it, Egypt is really symbolic, right? The pyramid is a really good picture of Egypt. Yeah. Pharaoh has the power structure, but it was built on, his power was built on what? The common people down here, the base of it. Well, the ideal of American government is just the opposite. It's meant to be something that uplifts it. It's like an inverted pyramid. And so the people should be the hierarchy of it. And as you go down, you see the branches of government that are meant to be the stabilizing force, but the people are meant to be promoted. And that's what if we keep the right ideals around the culture that we're here, it can sustain itself much longer because the people are always at play. Well, here it wasn't, right? The Libyans are pushing back pretty radically. So how do they gain power? One person at a time, one city at a time. They begin to and so there's certainly like rising up with military might and force, but the ideals of that way of life. Now I think if you are an Egyptian there and all of a sudden you hear this other voice, right? Maybe it's a Libyan voice, maybe it's Hittite, Cushite, whatever, an external voice that sounds more appealing than what you've been given, you might even be now saying, okay, this whole Egyptian concept isn't working for me as an individual, so maybe I'm going to give way to this new line of thinking. And so it wasn't just that Libyans were rising up, but the Egyptians in those areas where the Libyans took power were kind of saying, yeah, I'm not willing to die for this ideal anymore of divine kingship. It's not working out for me. So maybe this new thing in town is gonna help out. So does that help kind of frame out that question for you?
Yeah, definitely.
And so again, how do cultures rise and fall? Well, they rise and fall through ideas and the way that we promote things and certainly there's kind of this idea in Egypt, right, of propaganda that's been going on for a long time. Well, what's the problem with propaganda? Eventually the propaganda doesn't work. You have to come up with a different message, unless you have the truth. See, the truth is the one thing that can stand up against all forms of propaganda, because the truth is dispassionate, meaning the truth is absolute. It just is. The best example I can give to you, can I see your pencil? As we understand the world as it's created, right, there is an infallible truth to us as we live here on earth called gravity. Every time I throw this pen up, right? Because the earth is spinning on its axis and it's rotating around the sun, and there's gravitational pull. What will always happen? It will always come down. Now, I can make a bunch of propaganda that says, well, it won't come down. I'm going to make it stay up. And I can even generate, I can bring you to a room at NASA where I can generate a place where there's no gravity, and I can say, look at all this magic. Yeah. But is it really magic? No, it's not. Right? There's scientific truths that are realities. Yeah. And so I can keep the illusion of, like, I could bring a bunch of people to live in a weightless area where we control the gravity. And you guys could live there all your lives and think there's no such thing as gravity. But that would be nothing more than propaganda. because the reality is that outside of that, generally speaking, the way that the world works is we stay connected to the earth. Well, this is the whole concept behind Egyptian power or rule, right? This whole idea of divine kingship, was it built on truth? No.
Illusion, yeah.
It was an illusion. Yeah, it always was. Now the people didn't know that because they were pretty primitive still in their thinking. Well, as things are advancing now, they're kind of coming out from under the sway of this level of propaganda. There's actually a saying, I think it was in the 60s, where they talk about like a lot of marketing and promotion. It was a saying called being under the ether. And what that meant was you wanted to get somebody when you were marketing under the ether. And so basically ether is a type of drug that can knock you out. And so if you smelled ether, you'd faint. And so under the ether means that they've kind of knocked you out from reality and they're bringing you into this kind of idea. Like cigarettes were like really, really popular. Everyone used to believe, there was a while ago, that smoking a cigarette was really good for your lungs. Now what, like you guys think, and I go like, that's stupid, you're smoking. Like that seems so foreign to us. But because there was such a power the way that they marketed it, right? And everyone in Hollywood, when you see really old movies, right, you see these manly men who would smoke cigarettes, and these beautiful, demure women that were strong, like they would smoke cigarettes, and it was a symbol. And what they sold people was this concept or this idea that it was good for you. Well, who was selling that idea? The people making the cigarettes, right? All right. They weren't certainly going to tell you the truth of it and they probably knew the truth because, right, if we tell you smoking this cancer stick is going to give you cancer and all sorts of lung problems and you're going to have a really bad life in the end. Like, who's going to do that? Well, mostly no one. I mean, there's always some knuckleheads in the group that'll be like, yeah, I'll do that. And so, again, we have kind of this broken or fractured central power now. Libyans are rising up, external forces are coming in, internal forces with people in Egypt are pushing back against this idea and saying, okay, there's got to be a different way to work this out. And eventually what we'll see in the next few chapters is this leads us towards a steady decline until what happens? There's a world power that can truly be greater, and then that can totally come over top of that culture and take its place as the dominant culture. Right now, for quite some time, America is the superpower. But there is a country currently that is rising up in China with a tremendous amount of power, and they're using monetary power and buying out things in America and controlling certain things in America that probably don't serve us really well. And
want this view.
Yes, and they're very strategic in how they're doing that. And so you will probably see within your lifetime some pretty significant things going on between America and China as far as how we relate to them. And we're beginning to see some of that. Russia is becoming another power again too, as they're partnering with China in many ways. And so
now they're ready to get India on board.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so we see other countries are doing what? Beginning to push back. Well, what's happening within America? We're seeing a lot of focus on cultural things that do nothing to raise us up as a people, but are really tearing the fabric out of what has made us very noble, genuine, good, righteous people. There's a lot of internal struggles that are going out with external things, and people are feeling the weight of that. Your parents probably more so than you guys right now, because you guys are insulated to a certain degree, and hopefully you remain insulated from it, because there's a lot of nonsense. But we should be aware of the things that go on around us, because your generation is going to have to deal with, unfortunately, a lot of the mistakes of my generation. Not individually.
Well, what is
as a
that?
culture? Well, yeah. So we think about everything from economically, the decisions we make, to what we consider moral or immoral now. Things that are just crazy. Are the things that are promoted. And so,
especially by the family.
yes, the family culture is under attack. and what constitutes family, what constitutes what a man is and what a woman is and what their roles and responsibilities are, is completely under attack. And the great question will be, can our culture as a whole, can the American ideal stand up against it? And we have a part to play in that by doing what? Every culture is only as strong as its people, right? So the fourth question was Kayla's question. What was the phenomenon still prevalent that was noted by Greek historian Herodotus years later? And so that is on page 357, I think. Is that?
So you what?
Hold on. Nope. I'm too far back. I was in the wrong chapter.
Oh.
Okay, so 367. And we've kind of already alluded to this. We'll go about a quarter of the way down. It says, once the Libyan generals had gained power after the death of Ramses the 11th, their kinsmen had even less cause to integrate with the host population. And within a few generations, many families reverted to giving their children unashamedly Libyan names. And so this is a little bit to your question.
Oh, wow.
So how does it start? There's kind of a shift and a power, and there's some battles won. A couple of generations later, it starts with names. Now, why is that significant?
Because the name has a meaning behind it.
Name has power.
Yeah.
Yes. Your
Honor
name
and
has power.
tradition.
Yes.
Honor and culture.
And whether your parents, I'm assuming most of your parents probably had a reason or a purpose in naming you. But ultimately, who was the one that named you? It wasn't your parents. It was God who even planted within your parents' hearts how to name you. And there's a purpose in your name. Your name means something. And it's not just some kind of clever thing, right, that you click on, or you go on some Facebook thing and name generator, you put it in there, and then it tells you that it's not a fortune cookie. your name has inherent meaning in the kingdom. Inherent meaning. There's something that God is wanting to do within his people that he has named you. Right? We even see this in biblical names, or how God will change certain people's names. Right? And so there's a shift from Saul of Tarsus to Paul. Right? And what that name represented was an old nature and a new nature, right? An old culture, an old idea, and a new way of living that Paul would begin to live out, right? Killing Christians because he loved God. He was going to kill every Christian, and he was zealous for God, and he thought he was doing the right thing. And then God said, no. Jesus, came to him in the desert, and he said flat out, "Why are you persecuting my people? Like, you're working against me here." Right, and so there's a really clear shift that takes place. Libyan names, unashamedly Libyan names that were strange sounding to the Egyptians. Names such as Orokan, Shoshank, Iuput, Nimlat, and Takelot.
Which page you are in?
This is 367. About a quarter of the way up.
Oh, there you go. I'm sorry.
With such a strong sense, man, this is so powerful. With such a strong sense of their own identity, generations of inhabitants of the Western Delta regarded themselves as Libyans, not Egyptians.
What?
Now think about this. Their parents named them something different than the Egyptian culture, but they began to believe that they were not Egyptians, and they began to live like they were Libyans. Now, and we'll kind of close it, I think, here, because I think it's a good place for us to stop when we got through the questions. But think about how profound this is in spiritual understanding. If we stop seeing ourselves as whatever the world has defined us as, and for you, it could be there's some of us here that need to hear this, that you are not a failure, you don't constantly make mistakes, you're not dumb for doing that thing again. But we can be bought into this idea that we are less than, right? That we don't measure up, or we compare one another. Like, well, I'm not like my sibling is, or I wish I could be like my father was, or I wish I could do what my mom does. Well, no, God has uniquely created you, right? And there's power in your name that carries prophetic meaning. But there's even power in in your birth order. And so, right, we see this in firstborn sons and how God placed you within your family, the family that he has placed you in. Have you ever considered that within the context of your family, God has a very unique plan and purpose for you in that family unit itself? That the family as it's constituted, your family, would not be the way God designed it to be without your presence in it. And so your value in the family is just as significant as every other person's value. Now that doesn't mean you usurp the authority that God has given to your parents, right? Because God has an order within the family context. But your position in your family is of intrinsic value. Your life. Miles Monroe, as a pastor, preacher, teacher, he used to say this: your existence is evidence that this generation needs something that your life contains. The fact that you are drawing breath means God has a purpose in your generation. For you, specifically, uniquely. Now this is what is taking place. Historically, it's playing out. The Libyans are saying, we are not Egyptians. I am a Libyan. And that would mean something radically different to them. So how much more should you and I not conform ourselves to the ways of this world, but see ourselves as true sons of our Father in heaven? See, it's one thing to make a mental assent, to say, yeah, I know that's true. The Bible tells me, right? Like that's the little children's song, right? Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. We can sing that song, but until we actually stand on the promises of God and believe it, and not just believe it, but begin to live it out, begin to walk it out, right? Because there's a shift here. You have to be a Libyan for them meant they have to live out the ideals of Libya, which meant they had to push against the ideas of Egypt. No longer are we going to say we're Egyptians, we're Libyans, and that means something. Well, no longer are we going to be conformed to this world, the patterns of this world. And we're not merely going to just say, well, I'm a Christian. Well, no, I'm a son of God, and that means something. And that means something profound. And it means that everything we do has to be filtered through that lens. So how do we shift culture? Well, culture, again, it comes back to identity. With such a strong sense of their own identity, generations of inhabitants of the Western Delta regarded themselves as Libyans, not Egyptians, a phenomenon still prevalent enough to be remarked upon by the Greek historian Herodotus 5 centuries later. So 5 centuries after this, Herodotus, the Greek, one of the most famous historians of all time, is looking back and saying, wow, look at what has happened here. This is a secular person. And this, make no mistake about it, is something the Father is trying to reveal his purposes in. How significant is it for us to be rooted in our proper identity?
My God, lost identity is the most torturous experience you can have.
Yes.
Unless you don't care about life,
Right.
You know. So.
Well, and you don't care about it because you haven't been brought up in a cultural understanding of intrinsic value. This is why every historically evil thing that has ever happened, what has the perpetrators of evil done? They've attacked the identity of people. I know Kayla's reading this, and I've talked about this book before, but she's reading this book by Viktor Frankl, and this is one of the things he talks about. In the Holocaust, we know what the Holocaust is, the murder of millions of Jews at the hands of Germans. And I shouldn't generalize and say Germans, because many Germans were against it. They didn't rise up, they didn't say anything. The church, they didn't say anything. They just all sat there and watched it happen, right? This is where we get the saying that evil, the only thing that it takes for evil to endure is for good men to do nothing. We get that saying from. But we see the Aryans who were trying to eradicate the Jewish people. And so what did they do? They treated them inhumanely. They starved them. They brought them into rooms to say naked, completely naked. They stripped you away, right? That's pretty degrading in front of other people, just being completely naked. Bring you into rooms and say, we're going to give you guys showers, and they would drop acid on them. They would lead people into ovens and cook them. They would take babies and inject them with things, like all sorts of nasty things to see. What would it do if we injected them with, what about gasoline? Let's just feed them gasoline. Now think of that, just as horrendous. How can any man do that to another man? Well, they didn't value their life. Right? And so what is, again, the Bible gets us back to the very first parts of the Bible talks about that God created us in his two things. What and what? His image and likeness. So what does the enemy do? The first thing that he does to Adam and Eve, he gets them to believe that they're not created in God's image or his likeness. And he doesn't do that by coming out and saying, you're not that. He says, well, did God really say you couldn't have this? I think God doesn't want you to be like him. But where's the deception in that? Because what was the reality? Adam and Eve were already like God. What Satan sold them was, what the lie was, is that you have to do this thing. You have to sin. You have to eat from the thing that God said you couldn't eat so that you could truly be like God. But they didn't. If they would have stood on the truth, their identity as sons, they would have been able to say, no, shut up, Satan. That's stupid. I am a son created in God's image and likeness. See, all sin really at its very core, whenever we sin, it's because we've fallen out of tune with our image and likeness, with true sonship. We've stepped out of sonship and we've stepped into a different, we put on a different cloak, a different, clothing. By the way, the Bible talks about how we should be clothed in righteous. That biblical word literally means the right clothing. That we've put on Christ means we've put on the right thing to put on. And so, yeah, I mean, and sorry, I got kind of branched off there, but I think these are really good questions. And again, what it gets at us to understand, culturally speaking, the fall of Egypt came not immediately, but it is like every other culture. There's this slow deterioration. Well, how do we translate that to our own lives? Well, if we are truly trying to be sons of God and truly trying to create a culture and the family of God, right, building things the right way, every small compromise we make has the power to undermine us. And this is why we have to take spiritual authority of our lives against the work of the enemy. We do not wrestle against flesh or blood, but against principalities and powers. And so why don't we make compromises? Well, we don't do it just because in our minds, well, we're going to disappoint God. That's the wrong understanding. It's not about disappointing God. It's about honoring God. And see, the Egyptian mindset would keep you in fear. If you did that, then God's gonna. Well, that's not the heart of God for you. The heart of God is not, I'm gonna eternally punish you. In fact, the Bible says it is the kindness of God that leads us to repentance. Why do we repent? Because God is truly good and God is truly loving. And so our hearts are built to truly understand the loving heart of God, the tender heart of God. Now, that doesn't mean that God doesn't discipline. God will discipline. Certainly He will discipline. Any good parent will discipline. All right? God disciplines those whom He loves. And so identity is really, really critical for us to continue to understand. I think you guys know this probably better than most. But I would contend that your struggles, whatever those are today, and you know them and God knows them, whatever struggles you have, and I'm not going to look at anyone because I don't want anyone to assume I'm talking about you. The struggles that you have in your life currently are likely struggles because you're not looking at yourself through the proper lens of God. You are taking on a different identity that is not yours. You are never meant to put on that clothing, that garment, that understanding at all. And that you would be really well served to cast it off. And to not just cast off that garment, but to burn it, to annihilate it fervently, passionately, and then come back to the right path. Now, the reality is that for most of us, we are deceived, so we don't truly understand the fullness of our the mistakes that we make. This is why we need others. We need other people who can lovingly kind of help guide us, right? We have parents, leadership, brothers and sisters, friends. But it's why we have to keep our eyes and our ears attuned to the work of God in all things at all times, because God is speaking through us, not just through history or some book that some guy wrote, or He's speaking to us through, flipping burgers, and we come to some revelation about the way that the burger flipped, or what cleaning rooms, or having a conversation with somebody who may not even know God the way you know him. But again, getting back to one of the things I said, truth is truth, regardless of what we believe. And so we are always best served to get back to truth. And the perfect embodiment of truth is Jesus. I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life, right? True, proper divine kingship is demonstrated in the life of Christ and how he walked that out faithfully. And it's what we're, again, learning on Tuesdays. This theme that we keep coming up against is that we can have the very same life that Christ can. We can follow that very same pattern that he did. We can be truly fulfilled in the Father's purposes here today. But we will never be able to if our identity is not in true sonship. If we think anything less, if we're anything less than true sons, if we believe that in any part, we can't. It can't be really manifested in our lives. And so how do we deal with that? Well, it's not through feeling guilty, and it's not through beating yourself up. Paul said this to the Romans, there is therefore now no condemnation to those who are in Christ Jesus. Right? Condemned, people who are condemned, like condemned to die, means there is no hope for a reprieve or a stay of execution. This is why the Bible talks about conviction versus condemnation. In condemnation, there's no hope. In conviction, there's great hope. Conviction means that you're going to be disciplined for the sin that you committed, the wrong that you committed. But there's hope on the end of that. There's the ability to be renewed. And in fact, what's really exciting about that, and I'll leave it here, is what we're going to be talking about as we go into Tolstoy and Russian literature. They deal a great deal with this whole concept of turning over a new leaf and being regenerated. And there's a lot of really important Christian themes in there. In fact, the Death of Ivan Ilyich, which we'll be reading, is basically going to be answering the question for us, is how do we find meaning in life?
Wow.
Because the whole center of the book is a bunch of people afraid of death and trying to push death away. And there's one faithful person in the midst of that who would represent that, you know what? Death is actually a really healthy part of life. And it shouldn't be feared, it shouldn't be pushed away, but it should be embraced. And so we see through that narrative of Ivan Ilyich and his death, kind of grappling with our own understanding of how we fit into the world, which again goes back to this idea of identity. At the heart of any true culture is an identity. You can tell if a culture is healthy or not by what they build their identity upon. So that's that. All right. So next week I sent out your assignments. We will be reading the next two chapters, chapter 21 and 22. Good job again on the questions. Keep those up. We'll continue to flesh those out. In the meantime, if there's any other thoughts from this week that we didn't get to, please let me know. And that's it. Thanks.
Thank you. Nice work. Nice teaching. We need to give it a fun.
Yeah.
That's what I
All
think.
right.
Okay. Right. How long you had now?
Let's get Kelly going.
It used to be Elijah's.
Is that right?
It's pretty old.
Fix that.